On the evening of November 5th, 1936, Wallis Simpson sat at the dinner table inside Fort Belvedere, a small turreted castle in Windsor Great Park that belonged to the King of England, and presided over a meal she had organized in a house she had redecorated for guests who were not entirely sure they should be there. She had chosen the menu, she had rearranged the furniture, the flowers were hers, the seating was hers. Edward sat at her right, not at the head, which told anyone paying attention exactly how the room was organized. The guests paid attention. They were courtiers, diplomats, the careful social satellites of a king who was already in private government correspondence, being described as a problem. They watched Wallis the way people watch something they have been told to be cautious around, with smiles that did not involve the eyes. Wallis was 40 years old. She was thin, angular, immaculately dressed. She laughed at the right moments. She directed conversation with the confidence of a woman who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how rooms like this operated. What the room could not tell her, and what she may not yet have fully understood, was that the dinner itself, her competence, her control, her obvious influence over the king, was being noted as evidence against her. She had worked her entire life to sit at tables like this one. That work is where this story begins. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born on June 19th, 1896, in a summer cottage in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, 5 weeks early and small enough that the family was not immediately certain she would survive. Her father, Teakle Wallace Warfield, was already sick, tuberculosis, the quiet devastation of that era, and he died before she turned 1. What he left behind was a name she would carry, a family line she would spend her life invoking, and almost no money. The Warfields were Baltimore society. That distinction mattered enormously in a city where old family names functioned as a kind of currency, circulated carefully among the same dinner tables, the same churches, the same summer resorts decade after decade. Wallace's paternal uncle, Solomon Warfield, was a banker and eventually president of the Seaboard Airline Railway. The family had standing. What Wallis and her mother Alice did not have was the income to maintain it. Alice Warfield was a widow at 23 with an infant daughter and no independent means. She moved between relatives. She took charity from Solomon Warfield and others in the family, quietly, the way people accepted charity in that era, with gratitude expressed precisely enough that no one felt the need to examine it too closely. For a period, she ran a boarding house on Preston Street in Baltimore, cooking meals for paying residents in the same rooms where she was trying to raise a daughter who belonged by name to one of the city's better families. This was the particular cruelty of Wallace's childhood. She was inside the boundary, just. Her name was right. Her relatives attended the correct functions, but the money that made those functions legible, the clothes, the contributions, the ease of movement through expensive social space, was always borrowed, always contingent, always someone else's. She attended Arundel School in Baltimore on a subsidized rate arranged through the family. The subsidy was not advertised, but in a school that small, among girls whose fathers ran the institutions that were quietly funding her presence, it was not invisible either. She learned early that being watched and being seen are not the same thing. People watched her. What they saw, she could manage. In 1908, Alice Warfield married a man named John Freeman Racine, the son of a Democratic political boss, which provided temporary financial stability but complicated Wallace's position further. Racine was not Warfield. The marriage improved their circumstances in practical terms and lowered them in the taxonomy that Baltimore society ran on. Wallis understood this before she had language for it. She watched how her mother navigated the shift, the careful recalibration of tone, of social strategy, of which rooms to enter and how. What she was learning in these years was not resilience in any simple sense. She was learning that social position was a performance requiring constant maintenance, that the maintenance was exhausting, and that the cost of failure was not dramatic exclusion, but something quieter and more damaging, a gradual loss of access, of invitations, of the small confirmations that told a person they were considered. She was sent to Oldfield School in Glencoe, Maryland in 1912, one of the most expensive and socially prominent girls' boarding schools in the region. The tuition was paid by Solomon Warfield. Oldfields educated the daughters of the Baltimore elite, the Bonapartes, the Clarks, the Carrolls. Its motto was, "Gentleness and courtesy are expected of everyone at all times." The school was designed to finish young women into a particular kind of social legibility, the kind that made them good candidates for marriage into the families that already attended Oldfields. Wallis was sharp, funny, and immediately socially effective. She was elected leader of her class. She was not considered a beauty. Her jaw was strong, her features angular, her figure slight in an era that did not especially prize slightness. But she had the quality that compensates for conventional beauty in social environments. She made people feel when she was talking to them that the conversation was the most interesting thing happening. She cultivated this. It was not accidental. What she did not have, and what every girl around her did, was the next step the school was designed to deliver: a debut. The Baltimore debutante season was the formal mechanism by which young women of the right families were introduced to the young men of those same families, under conditions designed to produce marriages that would consolidate both. It required money, a new wardrobe, the subscription balls, the teas and dinners that formed the season's structure. Solomon Warfield funded a partial debut, enough that Wallis attended some events, was present in the rooms, was photographed in the white dress that signified eligibility and arrival. But partial debuts, like subsidized tuitions, leave marks. The girls who completed the season fully had fathers who purchased their membership in it. Wallis had an uncle who managed it as a financial favor. That difference was felt, if not always articulated by everyone involved, including Wallis. She was 20 when she met Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. at a party in Burlingame, California, in 1916. He was a Navy aviator, one of the first generation trained to fly, lean, handsome, uniformed, and possessed of the confidence that flying small machines at altitude in 1916 required. He was also the son of a Chicago stockbroker, which made him acceptable without being exceptional by the standards of the world Wallis had been trained toward. She married him 4 months later, in November 1916, at the Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore. Solomon Warfield paid for the wedding. Her uncle walked her down the aisle. There is a photograph from that day. Wallis in white, standing very straight, her bouquet held exactly as she had been taught to hold it. Her expression is composed in the way that expressions are composed when a person is aware of being watched and has spent years practicing what composed looks like. She was 20 years old. She had no income of her own, no professional training, no property. Her education had prepared her to be a wife inside a social class she had never quite been able to afford. She had chosen quickly a man who offered escape from her mother's apartments and her uncle's charity, and the permanent low-grade exposure of needing help in rooms where need was not supposed to show. The speed of the choice in hindsight said something about the pressure behind it. Earl Winfield Spencer drank. This was not immediately apparent in Burlingame at the party where Wallis met him, or in the 4 months of courtship that followed. It became apparent after the wedding, in the particular way that concealed things become apparent in marriage, gradually then in ways that could no longer be explained away. Win Spencer was stationed at Pensacola, Florida, where the Navy ran its aviation training program, and Wallis followed him there in late 1916 into a world she had not prepared for. Pensacola was a military base town. The social life was insular, organized entirely around rank and posting, and the wives of junior officers occupied a social stratum that had nothing to do with Baltimore debutante seasons or Oldfield schoolgirl hierarchies. The women Wallis lived among were competent, practical, and largely uninterested in the performance of refinement she had spent her adolescence constructing. She tried to make it work. She organized the small house they were given. She attended the base functions. She was charming, as she always was in rooms where charm was a navigable strategy. But Win's drinking worsened through 1917, and with it came a temperament that moved between sullenness and volatility in patterns she could not predict or manage. The specific texture of their domestic life in Pensacola is not fully documented, but the broad shape of it is. Win drank heavily and consistently. He was controlling. He monitored where Wallis went, who she spoke to, what she spent. There were periods where he locked her in rooms. A Navy wife in 1917 in a base town had a very limited set of options in response to any of this. Divorce was socially catastrophic and practically complicated. Separation required somewhere to go. Wallis had her mother, who had her own compromised circumstances, and her Uncle Solomon, whose generosity had always come with the implicit understanding that she was to conduct herself in ways that did not create problems. She did not leave. Instead, she adapted, which was what the situation permitted. She learned to read Wynn's moods with the precision that people develop when the cost of misreading them is high. She became skilled at managing his temperament in social settings, deflecting, redirecting, filling silences before they became incidents. This was a different education than Oldfields had provided, and it taught her something that would shape every relationship she entered afterward, that managing a volatile, powerful man was a skill, and that she was good at it. Wynn was posted to various stations through the war years: Boston, San Diego, Washington, and Wallis moved with him, or didn't. There were extended periods of separation, some voluntary, some the product of the Navy's indifference to the domestic arrangements of junior officers. During a posting in Washington in 1920, Wallis began spending time in circles that had nothing to do with Wynn. Diplomatic dinners, social events organized through a cousin, encounters with a wider and more interesting world than the base housing she'd been living in. In Washington, she met Felipe Espel, a secretary at the Argentine embassy, with whom she had a serious relationship that lasted several years in the spaces Wynn's postings created. Espel was educated, politically sophisticated, and moved in the diplomatic circles that represented exactly the kind of life Wallis had been reaching toward since Baltimore. He did not offer marriage. He was ambitious in his own career and understood that an American divorcee with no money and a drinking husband in the Navy was not a useful partner for an Argentine diplomat climbing his profession. The relationship ended without resolution, and the ending was his decision. The pattern: Wallis investing significantly in a relationship with a man whose ambitions or circumstances placed her just outside the boundary of what he was willing to formalize, would repeat. By 1921, Wallis and Wynn were effectively separated. He had been posted to Canton Island, and she declined to follow. She spent time in Washington, then traveled to Hong Kong, where her cousin Corinne's husband was stationed with the Navy. She was in China from late 1924 into 1925, a period of her life she was consistently vague about for the rest of it. What is documented is that she was in Hong Kong and Shanghai. What is not documented, because Wallis never documented it, is almost everything else about that year. She returned to the United States in 1925 and filed for divorce from Wynn Spencer shortly after. The divorce was granted in December 1927 in Warrenton, Virginia, on grounds of abandonment. She was 31 years old, divorced without income, and returning to a social world in which divorce was not disqualifying but was not nothing either. The Wallis who came back from China was more self-contained than the one who had followed Wynn Spencer to Pensacola. Something about the years she didn't discuss had either changed or clarified her. She was less interested in performing the correct emotions for rooms that had already decided what to make of her. What she was still interested in, what she had always been interested in the concrete way that people who have grown up without money are interested in it, was the specific texture of a well-organized, financially stable life. Not wealth in the abstract, the actual things. A house that was properly furnished, dinner parties that worked, clothes that were right for the rooms she intended to occupy. These were not shallow concerns to her. They were evidence of safety. They were the opposite of her mother's boarding house, of Solomon Warfield's charity, of the military base apartments she'd spent 6 years trying to make livable. She moved to New York for a period, staying with friends. She traveled to Europe in 1926 on borrowed money. The social arithmetic of credit and invitation she had learned to manage in Baltimore extended to a wider geography. In London, she stayed with old acquaintances. She moved through rooms that were interesting to her without yet having a fixed position in any of them. In 1927, at a party in New York, she met Ernest Aldrich Simpson. He was Anglo-American, a Harvard man, recently divorced himself, and employed in his family's shipping business in London. He was not glamorous. He was steady, intelligent, genuinely well-read, and entirely comfortable in the upper-middle registers of English social life. He was, in the specific way that mattered to Wallis at 31, available and serious. She assessed this quickly. She had been assessing rooms and their possibilities since she was old enough to understand what a subsidized tuition meant. There is a gap in Wallis Simpson's biography that no document closes. It runs from late 1924 to mid-1925, covers parts of Hong Kong, Shanghai, and possibly Peking, and exists in her own telling as a series of careful omissions. Trips mentioned without detail, acquaintances named without context, months that accumulate into almost a year and produce no letters, no photographs, no social record of the kind that Wallis, who was meticulous about her own presentation, left everywhere else. She wrote a memoir, The Heart Has Its Reasons, published in 1956. The China chapters are the shortest in the book. They describe sightseeing, they describe the heat, they describe a boat. The silence itself became part of the story told about her. She arrived in Hong Kong in late 1924, traveling to join her cousin Corinne Muston, whose husband Henry was stationed there as a Navy commander. This much is documented. The setting she entered was a particular colonial world. British administrators, American naval officers, the international social tier that gathered in Hong Kong's clubs and hotels above a city that most of its foreign residents experience primarily as atmosphere. It was a world of surface pleasures and significant hierarchies, where the right introduction still determined which rooms you entered and on what terms. Wallis had introductions. She had always moved well in transit. The temporary social spaces of ships and hotels and postings suited her skill set precisely because they reset the room. Nobody in Hong Kong knew about the boarding house on Preston Street or the subsidized tuition at Oldfields. She arrived as a Navy wife from a Baltimore family, which was entirely sufficient. From Hong Kong, she traveled to Shanghai, which in 1924 was something genuinely unlike any other city she had encountered. The international settlement and the French concession had produced a social world of remarkable density and strangeness. White Russian émigrés, British merchants, American journalists, Chinese businessmen operating across the settlement's legal peculiarities, and a nightlife infrastructure that existed in the gaps between competing jurisdictions. The rules that organized Baltimore or Pensacola or Washington did not apply in Shanghai in the same configuration. This was either liberating or dangerous, depending on what a person did with it, and sometimes both simultaneously. What Wallis did in Shanghai is where the documented record stops. The rumors that attached themselves to this period of her life were specific and damaging and followed her into the highest levels of British government. When the relationship with Edward became a constitutional matter in 1936, Maui Five and the Foreign Office pulled together what they knew, or believed they knew, about Wallis's background. A report compiled for the Prime Minister's office described activities in Shanghai that, if accurate, would have been considered scandalous by the standards of any era, involving relationships with men in the city's demi-mondo and practices that the report characterized in terms that were clearly designed to make her seem both morally disqualified and potentially subject to blackmail. The report has been partially declassified. Its specific claims are unverified. The people named in it cannot be confirmed as having known her. It may have been assembled from rumor rather than intelligence, and the British establishment in 1936 had significant motivation to construct a disqualifying file on a woman they were already determined to remove from the king's orbit. But the establishment did not invent the silence. That was Wallis's own. She gave different accounts of China at different times to different people. To some, she suggested the year had been essentially social: parties, sightseeing, the expat circuit. To others, she hinted at experiences that had educated her in ways she didn't specify. Herman Rogers, an American friend she made during this period who remained close to her for decades, knew the China years well and said nothing about them publicly for the rest of his life. His discretion was absolute and therefore conspicuous. What the silence produced practically was a permanent vulnerability. Throughout her relationship with Edward, and throughout the abdication crisis and throughout the rest of her life, the China years functioned as a door that anyone could knock on. She could not close it because she had never opened it. The British press, operating under a voluntary blackout on reporting about Edward and Wallis through most of 1936, was nonetheless aware of what was in circulation. American newspapers were not under the same constraints and printed versions of the Shanghai rumors that were read by anyone who subscribed to an American paper, which, in 1936, included most of the British establishment. She returned to the United States in 1925 and said nothing about what she was returning from. She filed for divorce from Win Spencer and began rebuilding a social life in Washington and New York with the composure of someone who had decided that the past was a room she no longer needed to enter. This was, in one sense, a reasonable decision. People rebuilt after difficult marriages. The 1920s offered more room for reinvention than the decade before it. The divorce, once finalized, was a clean legal document that established abandonment as its cause and assigned no particular scandal to either party. But China did not function as the past. It traveled with her. Every significant investigation of her background that was conducted over the following decade, by the British government, by hostile journalists, by courtiers trying to understand what exactly the king had attached himself to, went back to those months and found the same absence she had constructed. She had learned in Baltimore that what people couldn't see, they would imagine. She had learned in Pensacola that what couldn't be managed, it was sometimes better to survive quietly. What she had not fully accounted for was that a deliberate silence, maintained with too much consistency, has its own legibility. The gap looked like something being hidden because it was the shape of something being hidden, regardless of what the something actually was. In 1927, living in Washington with friends, moving through the social calendar with the careful economy of a woman operating on limited resources, she was 30 years old and carrying a reputation she had never been given the opportunity to address directly. She met Ernest Simpson at a party in New York that autumn and recognized, with the acuity she had been developing since girlhood, that he was offering her a clean start in a city where the Shanghai rumors had not yet arrived. She accepted his company. She assessed his steadiness. She began, with the patience she had learned the hard way, to construct the next version of herself. Ernest Aldrich Simpson was the kind of man who read history for pleasure and remembered what he read. He was methodical, affectionate in a contained way, and genuinely interested in the world, in architecture, in military history, in the specific pleasures of a well-run household, and a dinner table where the conversation moved. He was not exciting. He was, after Win Spencer, the precise opposite of exciting, and Wallis understood this when she married him in July 1928 at the Chelsea Register office in London, with no family present on either side. The wedding was small, by necessity and possibly by preference. Ernest's family, the Simpson shipping family with offices in London and New York, was respectable without being grand. Wallis's family, what remained of it? Solomon Warfield, having died in 1927 and left her a small bequest that was her first independent money, was in Baltimore, and Baltimore was no longer the stage she was designing for. London was. She had decided this before the wedding, possibly before the engagement, in the way that Wallis made decisions, by assessing the available geography and choosing the direction with the most viable route forward. They moved into a flat in Mayfair, on Bryanston Court, and Wallis began the project of their social life with the systematic attention she brought to everything she considered important. She studied London. She read the newspapers carefully, tracking names and events and the social cartography of who mattered and in what contexts. She learned which shops were correct and which were merely expensive, a distinction that London in the late 1920s enforced with the quiet severity of a city that had been making these determinations for centuries. She furnished the flat with a combination of Ernest's solid inherited pieces and her own developing eye for the specific kind of elegance that looked effortless rather than purchased. She was, by every account from people who attended, an exceptional hostess. The dinners at Bryanston Court had a quality that went beyond the food or the table settings. They had pace, they had direction, they moved in the way good conversations move when someone is managing them without appearing to. Wallis seated people with intention, introduced subjects at the right moments, and had the gift of making each guest feel that she had arranged the evening specifically with them in mind. Chips Channon, the Anglo-American socialite and politician who would become a significant social chronicler of the era, attended early dinners at Bryanston Court and noted the quality of the table. He was not easily impressed, and he was impressed. Ernest facilitated this. He was proud of Wallis's social intelligence and contributed to it. His knowledge of history and his genuine interest in ideas made him a useful dinner companion. But he understood that the social architecture was hers. This was, for some years, a working arrangement that suited both of them. He had the life he wanted, a cultivated wife, a well-run household, access to a social world more interesting than the shipping business provided on its own. She had financial stability, a legitimate address in a city she intended to climb, and a husband who did not lock her in rooms. The stability was real, but its ceiling was visible. Ernest was comfortable, not wealthy. The flat was good, but not grand. London society, the actual social tier that Wallis was aiming at, was stratified in ways that made Baltimore look casual. The British class system in the late 1920s and early 1930s was not a metaphor. It was a set of mechanisms, most of them invisible to people who had grown up inside them, and therefore legible only by their effects to people arriving from outside. Wallis arrived from outside. She could read a room extraordinarily well, but she was reading a room whose grammar she had learned as an adult, and native speakers can always tell. She was introduced to British society through Emerald Cunard and other American-born hostesses who occupied a peculiar and useful niche in London's social world. Wealthy enough, connected enough, and foreign enough to build bridges between the old English establishment and the international set that gathered around it. These women understood Wallis's situation because they had navigated versions of it themselves. They liked her. They included her. But inclusion in Emerald Cunard's circle was not the same as inclusion in the world the circle orbited. The rejections were rarely direct. They came as omissions, the invitation that didn't arrive, the introduction that wasn't made, the moment at a party where the conversation closed before she fully entered it. She noticed all of these. She cataloged them with the same precision she brought to the table settings, because the table settings and the social exclusions were solving the same problem. The problem of being perpetually on the outside of the room she was trying to be inside. In 1931, through the network she had been building, she met Lady Thelma Furness, an American-born socialite who was the current mistress of Edward, Prince of Wales. Thelma liked Wallis. She found her amusing and sharp and sufficiently sophisticated to be useful company in the social world that surrounded Edward. In January 1931, Wallis and Ernest were introduced to the prince at a house party in Melton Mowbray. The introduction was ordinary, a weekend gathering, shooting weather, the particular social atmosphere of the English country house party, where rank was simultaneously on display and pretending to be relaxed. Edward was 36. He was handsome in the way that photographs had made famous across the empire. Slight, blonde, with a quality of restlessness that made him seem perpetually elsewhere even when he was present. He had been the most photographed man in the world for a decade. He had toured the dominions, shaken an incalculable number of hands, delivered speeches about duty and service and the bonds of empire, and returned from each of these obligations to Fort Belvedere, where he gardened and played bagpipes and surrounded himself with Americans and divorcees and people who did not require him to be the Prince of Wales. He shook Wallis's hand at Melton Mowbray, and the meeting ended. She returned to London and to Ernest and to the dinners at Bryanston Court. 2 years passed in which nothing significant happened between them. She continued building the life she was building, one dinner at a time, one introduction at a time, in a city that was prepared to be charmed by her, but not to fully absorb her. Ernest read his history books in the evenings. Wallis planned the next dinner. Outside the flat on Bryanston Court, London moved through the early years of the Depression with the specific British quality of suffering that doesn't announce itself, and the world Wallis was trying to enter grew, if anything, more determined to remain exactly what it was. In January 1934, Thelma Furness left for the United States to visit her twin sister. Before she sailed, she asked Wallis Simpson to look after the prince, to keep him company, to make sure he was all right in her absence. It was the kind of request that makes sense only inside a particular social world, one where the management of powerful men was understood to be women's work, and where Thelma's confidence in Wallis reflected genuine affection and a failure to read what was already developing. Wallis looked after the prince. By the time Thelma returned in March, something had shifted in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Edward was calling Bryanston Court daily. He was appearing at Wallis's dinners with a frequency that exceeded any plausible social explanation. He was, in the specific way that men who have decided something signal it before they say it, already decided. Thelma noticed at a Fort Belvedere dinner that Edward and Wallis shared a private joke she was not part of. She wrote about it later, the small moment of exclusion at her own table, the quality of attention Edward directed at Wallis, the understanding that arrived before she had words for it. She confronted Wallis about it. Wallis denied that anything had changed. Thelma's relationship with Edward effectively ended within weeks. What Edward had found in Wallis was not simple to characterize, and the people who tried to characterize it at the time mostly failed because they were looking for the wrong thing. They looked for beauty and found her angular and sharp-featured. They looked for obvious sexuality and found instead a woman who was controlled and precise. They looked for the conventional appeal of a royal mistress and found someone who criticized the prince's tie and reorganized his kitchen and told him at dinner that he was wrong about something. This last quality was the one that mattered. Edward had been the Prince of Wales for 23 years. He had been managed, scheduled, briefed, costumed, and guided through an endless sequence of public obligations by courtiers whose entire professional existence depended on his smooth functioning within the institution. In private, he was surrounded by people who deferred to him, who laughed at his jokes because he was the prince, who agreed with his opinions for the same reason. The deference was total, and had been total since childhood. George V ran the royal household with military formality, and the formality extended to his children. Edward had grown up in an environment where emotional directness was a violation of protocol, and approval was always conditional on performance. Wallis did not defer. She told him his Americanisms were showing when he used slang she found grating. She criticized the food at Fort Belvedere and then improved it by taking over the running of the kitchen. She moved furniture. She expressed opinions about his friends and his schedule and his habits with a directness that nobody in his life had consistently offered him. She treated him in private less like the heir to the throne and more like a man who needed organizing. He found this extraordinary. He came back to it repeatedly, with increasing dependence, in the way that people return to the one thing that feels real in a life that has otherwise been managed into unreality. What is harder to assess is what Wallis found in him. She was not unaware of what he was. She had been reading London carefully for 4 years and understood exactly what proximity to the Prince of Wales meant in the social architecture she had been trying to penetrate. She was also, by multiple accounts, genuinely fond of him, amused by him, moved by the quality of need he directed at her, perhaps flattered in ways she could not entirely separate from the strategic value of the relationship. These things are not mutually exclusive, and there is no clean line between them. What the relationship gave her, immediately and practically, was access to every room she had been standing outside. Fort Belvedere weekends, the Ritz, Biarritz. The social world that had been extending partial invitations now extended full ones, because the Prince of Wales was coming, and he was bringing Wallis Simpson, and that fact reorganized every room's priorities. Ernest Simpson was aware of the relationship's development and responded to it in a way that remained somewhat opaque. He did not immediately object. He attended Fort Belvedere weekends alongside Wallis and Edward through 1934 and into 1935, occupying the position of husband with a steadiness that some observers read as complacency and others read as a private negotiation whose terms they weren't party to. He wrote Wallis a letter at some point in this period. The exact date is uncertain, in which he said he hoped she knew what she was doing. The letter suggests awareness without ultimatum. By 1935, the triangle was public knowledge within the social world it operated in, which was a world without effective borders given its members' habits of correspondence. Letters were written between London and New York and Paris describing what was happening. The American press, operating without the restraint that the British press had already begun to exercise toward anything involving the prince, was running stories. In the United States, Wallis Simpson was becoming famous. In Britain, officially, she did not yet exist as a public figure. Edward became king on January 20th, 1936, following the death of George V. The accession was immediate. In the British constitutional structure, there is no gap between reigns, and Edward went from Prince of Wales to King Emperor of 350 million people between one breath and the next. Wallis was at Sandringham when George V died. She had been present in the house. This detail was not reported in the British press. It was reported everywhere else. In the months following the accession, the relationship between the new king and Wallis Simpson continued to develop in full view of the court, the government, and every foreign embassy in London. Edward made no attempt at concealment. He seemed, if anything, impatient with the social fictions that had previously managed the situation. He referred to Wallis in conversations with courtiers with a candor that alarmed them. He included her in plans and decisions in ways that exceeded any previous understanding of what a royal companion's role involved. The courtiers who alarmed wrote memos. The memos went to the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, read them and began preparing for a conversation he did not want to have. Fort Belvedere sat in Windsor Great Park on 30 acres of grounds that Edward had been given permission to occupy in 1930 and had immediately begun reshaping according to his own preferences. The castle itself was small by royal standards, a Georgian Gothic folly extended into something habitable, with turrets that served no military purpose and rooms that required constant attention to keep from feeling damp. Edward had cleared the overgrown gardens himself, physically, with a machete, working alongside whatever guests were present on weekend mornings, with the focused energy of a man who needed something to do with his hands. He had installed a swimming pool. He had modernized the kitchen. He had decorated in a style that mixed American comfort with English tradition in a way that satisfied neither fully but felt like his own. This was, in miniature, the problem Edward carried everywhere, the reach toward something genuine inside a life that had been designed for him by others, producing results that were sincere but slightly off, real but not quite right. Wallis arrived at Fort Belvedere for weekends and treated it with the same organizing intelligence she had brought to the Bryanston Court flat. She worked with the chef on menus. She rearranged the flowers. She introduced American cocktails before dinner, the proper proportions, the correct temperature. In a house that had previously managed its pre-dinner hour with the vague English tolerance for lukewarm drinks and ambient discomfort. These were small interventions, domestic in scale, but they accumulated into something significant. The house began to feel, to the people who visited it, like Wallis's house. The guests noticed. They were careful people, most of them, members of Edward's personal set, the Anglo-American social tier that moved between London and New York and Biarritz, people like the Rogerses and the Hunters and Chips Channon, who moved through these rooms with the particular attentiveness of people who understood that what was happening at Fort Belvedere was going to matter. They watched Wallis manage the household and manage Edward simultaneously, and the watching was not casual. These were people who wrote letters and kept diaries, and the letters and diaries are explicit about what they observed, a woman who had made herself indispensable to a man who was also the king. The surveillance, however, was not limited to social observers. By 1935, the special branch of the Metropolitan Police maintained a file on Wallis Simpson. So did MI5. The Foreign Office had made inquiries through its Washington contacts about her background. The Home Office was receiving reports. This apparatus of observation existed in parallel to the social world of Fort Belvedere weekends and Ritz dinners and Biarritz holidays, invisible to the participants but shaping everything around them. The files accumulated detail. They noted visitors to Bryanston Court. They tracked correspondence. One report, compiled in 1935, described a relationship between Wallis and a man named Guy Marcus Trundle. Described in the file as a car salesman with connections to the Ford Motor Company, suggesting that while the relationship with Edward was developing, Wallis was maintaining at least one other significant attachment. The Trundle file has been partially released and its specific claims are, like the Shanghai material, unverified. The intelligence services of the period were not neutral observers of the situation. They had institutional interests in the outcome, and their files should be read with that in mind. What can be said is that Wallis was living, from at least 1935 onward, inside a degree of surveillance that she was only partially aware of. She knew she was watched socially. The dinners were full of people who reported to other people, and she was sophisticated enough to understand this. She did not fully understand the extent to which the state itself was watching, reading her letters, tracking her movements, building a file that would be used against her when the moment came. She wrote letters to Edward constantly. He wrote back. The correspondence was voluminous and intimate. She addressed him by the nickname she had given him. He wrote with a dependency that alarmed the people who saw it. In his letters, he referred to her as the only real thing in his life. He described Fort Belvedere as existing only when she was in it. He used the diminutive and sentimental language of a man who has located in one person the entire weight of his emotional existence. This was a considerable weight to locate anywhere. Wallis's letters to Edward in this period were, by the accounts of those who saw them before they were sealed in the royal archives, more measured than his. She was warm. She was direct. She did not match the scale of his emotional investment with equivalent declaration. Whether this reflected genuine feeling, strategic caution, or simply the temperamental difference between them, is impossible to resolve. The letters remain sealed. Ernest Simpson had by 1935 largely withdrawn from the Fort Belvedere weekends. He continued to maintain the apartment at Bryanston Court and the formal structure of the marriage, but the marriage had become a legal container holding a situation that had outgrown it. He was seeing a woman named Mary Kirk, an old friend of Wallis's from Baltimore, who would eventually become his third wife. The geometry of these arrangements had the quality of a negotiation conducted through behavior rather than conversation, with each party acting on an understanding that had never been directly stated. In the autumn of 1935, Wallis visited a doctor in London about a digestive problem that had been worsening for months. The diagnosis was an ulcer, likely stress-related. She was prescribed a restricted diet and rest. She modified her diet and did not rest. The Fort Belvedere weekends continued. The London dinners continued. The correspondence with Edward continued at its existing volume. She managed the symptoms the way she managed everything that threatened the life she was maintaining, by refusing to let them interrupt it. Edward's circle tightened around Wallis through that autumn and into 1936. The friends who had expressed reservations about the relationship's trajectory, and there were several, found themselves less frequently invited. The guests at Fort Belvedere became a more curated group, people who had already demonstrated their willingness to treat Wallis as the center of the household without commenting on what that meant. The rooms had been rearranged. The guest list had been rearranged. The menu had been changed. Everything at Fort Belvedere was, by early 1936, organized around Wallis Simpson's presence, including the King of England. Stanley Baldwin had been Prime Minister twice before he returned to Downing Street in 1935. And he understood the British political temperament with the particular intimacy of a man who had spent decades navigating it. He was not a dramatic figure. He did not move quickly or speak in declarations. He was a deliberate man who preferred to let situations clarify themselves before acting. And the situation clarifying itself through the first half of 1936 was one he had been watching with the focused dread of someone who can see where a road leads and cannot yet find the mechanism to close it. He met with the king in October 1936 at Fort Belvedere to discuss what he called the marriage question. The meeting had been preceded by months of private communication between Downing Street, Buckingham Palace's senior staff, and the leaders of the Dominion governments, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, who had each been quietly consulted about whether their populations would accept a king married to an American divorcee. The answers came back in varying degrees of diplomatic language that all meant the same thing. They would not. Baldwin arrived at Fort Belvedere and was received by Edward in a sitting room that Wallis had furnished. He presented the situation as the government understood it. The relationship had become publicly known outside Britain. It was creating instability, and it could not continue in its current form without consequence for the monarchy. Edward listened and then said something that Baldwin had not been prepared for, or perhaps had been prepared for, and had been hoping not to hear. He said he intended to marry Wallis Simpson. Baldwin drove back to London. He wrote in his notes from the meeting that the king had seemed entirely resolved, and that the resolution had the quality not of a decision recently made, but of something that had been decided for a long time. The British press had maintained a voluntary silence on the relationship throughout 1936, an agreement brokered through informal channels between newspaper proprietors and the palace. This silence was, by November, a source of significant tension inside the newspaper world itself. The foreign press had been reporting freely for months, American papers were available in London, and the gap between what people knew privately and what appeared in British print was becoming its own kind of public fact. When the Bishop of Bradford, Alfred Blunt, gave a diocesan speech on December 1st that touched on the king's need for divine grace without explicitly naming the reason, it was treated by the regional press as permission to break. The Yorkshire Post ran a story. Others followed within hours. The dam broke on December 3, 1936, when the national press published the situation in full. The British public, in the official version of events, learned about Wallis Simpson on that day. In the actual version of events, most of the British public had known for months through American papers, through returned travelers, through the reliable transmission system of rumor, in a society where information moved through clubs and servants' quarters and church halls with equal efficiency, regardless of what the newspapers were printing. What the press coverage produced was not new knowledge, but official acknowledgement, which in Britain carried a different weight. The thing had been named. The king was in love with an American divorcee and intended to marry her. The government would not support the marriage. The options were being discussed. Wallis understood what was happening with a clarity that Edward, in his conviction that the situation could be resolved in his favor, did not share. She had been reading rooms since childhood, and she read this one without illusion. The British establishment, the government, the Church of England, the senior courtiers, the Dominion governments had aligned against her with a unanimity that left no viable opening. She was not dealing with social exclusion of the kind she had navigated before, the omitted invitation or the closed conversation. She was dealing with an institution that had been managing kings for centuries and had developed, over those centuries, a comprehensive toolkit for doing so. She told Edward she would leave. She told him this more than once in the weeks between Baldwin's Fort Belvedere visit and the abdication. She said she was prepared to remove herself from the situation, that the relationship did not need to end a reign, that she could go abroad, and the crisis would resolve. She may have meant this. She may have understood that Edward would not accept it. The two possibilities are not separable from each other, and Wallis was not a woman who made statements without understanding their effects. Edward would not accept it. He wrote to her constantly during this period with the intensity of the letters that had preceded it, amplified now by crisis. He called her several times daily. When she traveled to France in late November, having agreed with Edward and with his solicitor Walter Monckton that her removal from the country might ease the political pressure, he called her at the Villa Louviers in Cannes, where she was staying with the Rogerses, and the calls lasted hours. The British public's response to the press coverage was not what the establishment had entirely anticipated. There was significant sympathy for the king, particularly among working-class communities that had followed his tours and his public expressions of concern about unemployment and poverty. Letters arrived at Downing Street defending Edward's right to marry whom he chose. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace with signs. A King's party organized itself loosely around Winston Churchill, who had not yet decided what he thought, but was temperamentally opposed to the government managing the monarch's private life, and said so in the House of Commons, with results that did not help his political standing. But the sympathy, real as it was, had no constitutional mechanism. The Church of England would not sanction a marriage to a twice-divorced woman while her previous husbands lived. The Prime Minister would not support it. The Dominion governments would not support it. The legal instrument of a morganatic marriage, by which Edward could marry Wallis without her becoming queen, had been explored and rejected by the cabinet. The doors were not being closed one at a time. They were closed simultaneously, from the inside, by people who had decided before the public conversation began what the outcome would be. Wallis sat in the Villa Louviers in Cannes and listened to Edward on the telephone and understood that the decision had already been made and that the question was only which version of the ending would be allowed to proceed. On the evening of December 10, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere. 3 of his brothers signed as witnesses. The document was brief, fewer than 200 words, and transferred the throne of the United Kingdom and the British dominions and the title Emperor of India to his brother Albert, who would become George VI. Edward signed with the pen he used for everything, without ceremony, in the sitting room that Wallis had furnished and that she was not present in. She was at the Villa Louviers in Cannes, sitting by the radio. She heard the abdication speech the following evening, December 11th, broadcast from Windsor Castle, after Edward had received royal assent and was no longer king. The speech had been written with the help of Winston Churchill, who had worked on the language with the care of a man who understood that the words would be remembered. Edward spoke for less than 10 minutes. He said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. Wallis heard this in a room full of people, the Rogerses, a small group of friends who had gathered at the villa, and by multiple accounts she wept. What she said immediately afterward, if anything, is not recorded. Herman Rogers, who was present, wrote in his diary that she was very quiet for a long time after the broadcast ended. The specific texture of what she had understood in those moments is not recoverable. What is recoverable is the sequence of events that the abdication immediately produced, and what those events meant for her in practical terms. Edward was no longer king. He was given the title Duke of Windsor by his brother George VI on the morning after the abdication, which resolved the question of what to call him, but created an immediate and bitter subsidiary question: what to call her. George VI, advised by his senior courtiers and by his wife Elizabeth, who had formed a view of Wallis Simpson that she maintained without significant revision for the rest of her life, declined to extend the title. Her Royal Highness to Wallis when she and Edward married. Edward would be His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. Wallis, upon marriage, would be the Duchess of Windsor, but not Her Royal Highness. This was a distinction whose practical consequences were largely ceremonial, but whose symbolic weight was considerable, and Edward understood its weight completely. The denial of the HRH meant that when Wallis and Edward were in a room together, she was required to curtsy to members of the royal family while he was not. It meant that she occupied a formal position below any royal duchess, below princesses, below the institution that Edward had given up the throne to marry into by leaving. It was, in the specific grammar of royal protocol, a permanent marker of her unacceptability. Edward spent much of the rest of his life attempting to reverse this decision and failed completely. He raised it with his brother, with courtiers, with government ministers, across decades of correspondence and conversation. The answer was always, through various diplomatic circumlocutions, no. In December 1936, however, all of this was still ahead. The immediate situation was that Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, was in England and Wallis was in France, and they were not yet married and could not immediately marry because Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson had been granted only in October, a decree nisi requiring 6 months before it became absolute. They could not see each other. The proprieties of the situation, even now, even after the throne had been vacated, required separation. Ernest Simpson had cooperated with the divorce proceedings in a way that remained somewhat opaque. The divorce was granted on grounds of his adultery. He had arranged to be found, in the formal legal choreography that English divorce law required in this period, in a hotel room with a woman who was not his wife. This was a common mechanism understood by everyone involved to be procedural rather than substantive. Ernest had been seeing Mary Kirk. The legal fiction served everyone's needs, but the cooperation itself, the willingness to be the guilty party in proceedings that allowed Wallis to move toward the king, was a significant act, and its motivation was private in ways that Ernest never made public. Wallis remained at the Villa Louviers through the winter. The villa was comfortable and the Rogerses were kind, and the situation was, in its surface arrangements, manageable. It was also a form of waiting that had no clear end and was surrounded by the press, which had gathered outside the villa in numbers that made any movement an event. Photographers followed the cars. Journalists wrote daily dispatches. She was the most written about woman in the world in December 1936, and she could not walk to the garden without it being recorded. The letters she received during this period were not uniformly sympathetic. A significant number were hostile, some obscenely so. Letters from members of the British public who had formed views about what she had done to the monarchy and expressed those views in language that ranged from cold condemnation to explicit threat. She read some of them. She did not respond. She had been managing the distance between public perception and private reality since Baltimore, and she managed it now with the same controlled surface, though the scale of the hostility was unlike anything she had previously encountered. In England, the transition was proceeding with the institutional efficiency that the British monarchy brought to all its transitions. George VI was proclaimed. The court reorganized, the households shifted, the staff at Fort Belvedere were given notice. The house was closed up and returned to the crown, the swimming pool covered, the gardens left to begin their reversion toward the overgrowth that Edward had spent years cutting back. Edward left England on the night of December 11th, the night of the broadcast, traveling to Austria to stay with friends while the 6 months of the divorce decree ran their course. He and Wallis were separated by geography and requirement through a winter that was, for both of them, a period of waiting in which the thing they were waiting for, the marriage, was the only fixed point in a situation that had dissolved everything else around it. She had the fixed point. She did not yet understand what the fixed point was going to cost. The Château de Condé sat in the Loire Valley in the Touraine region of France and belonged to Charles Badeau, an American-born French industrialist who had made his fortune developing a labor efficiency system used in factories across Europe and the United States. Badeau had offered the chateau to Edward and Wallis for their wedding as a gesture of hospitality toward people who had, by the spring of 1937, very few places they could go that were not managed by the press or complicated by politics. The offer was accepted. The chateau was beautiful, stone, formal gardens, a private chapel, and Badeau was socially ambitious in ways that the connection to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor would serve directly. The wedding was on June 3, 1937. Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson had become absolute in April, removing the legal impediment. The ceremony was conducted by a Church of England clergyman named Robert Anderson Jardine, the vicar of St. Paul's in Darlington, who had written to Edward offering to officiate after the Church of England's official position, that its clergy should not perform the marriage, had left the couple without a minister. Jardine came without permission from his bishop. He was subsequently banned from officiating in England and eventually emigrated to the United States, where he charged admission fees for lectures about the wedding. 16 people attended. The guest list was not small by accident or by preference. It was small because the people Edward had expected to come did not come. His brothers sent no representatives. His mother, Queen Mary, who had written Edward a letter after the abdication that was correct in its condolences and absolute in its judgment, did not attend and did not send a message for the day. His sister, the Princess Royal, did not attend. The British government sent no representative. The British Embassy in Paris sent no representative. The court circular, the official record of royal engagements, did not mention the wedding. Walter Monckton, who had been Edward's solicitor and one of his few genuine connections to the world he had left, had intended to attend and was prevented at the last moment by pressure from the palace. He sent his regrets, and Edward understood what the regrets meant. Wallis wore a dress designed by Mame Boucher, the American couturier based in Paris, or a simple gown in what became known afterward as Wallis blue, a pale blue-gray that matched her eyes. She carried no bouquet. Her hair was pulled back. The photographs from that day show her composed and precisely turned out in the way she always was in photographs, the surface absolutely managed. What the photographs cannot show is the texture of the day around the images, the small gathering in a borrowed chateau, the unauthorized clergyman, the absence that organized itself around the 16 people present like a shape. Edward wept during the ceremony. Multiple accounts from those present confirm this. He stood in the small room at the Château de Condé and cried while the words were read with the quality of emotion that had always characterized his attachment to Wallis. Total, unconcealed, slightly frightening in its intensity. Wallis did not weep. She stood straight and said the words, and when it was done, she was the Duchess of Windsor, not Her Royal Highness. The letters patent confirming Edward's title had been issued by George VI in March, and the question of Wallis's title had been settled, or rather had been deliberately left unsettled in the way that produces maximum clarity about intent. The palace's position was communicated through a government announcement on May 27th, 1 week before the wedding. The Duchess of Windsor would not hold the style of Her Royal Highness. The announcement offered a legal rationale involving the nature of Edward's renunciation, which constitutional lawyers subsequently disputed at length without changing the outcome. Edward was informed before the wedding. He told Wallis. What she said in response is not recorded in any source that has been made public. What is recorded is that Edward's reaction was one of sustained fury, not hot, not immediately expressed, but the cold, persistent fury of a man who understood that the denial was deliberate and personal and that it would not be reversed. He wrote to his brother. He wrote to the Prime Minister. He wrote to the royal solicitors. He raised the question every few years for the next 3 decades with the regularity of someone who cannot let go of an injustice that has no mechanism of appeal. The honeymoon was spent at Schloss Wasserleonberg in Austria, lent by a local count. They were there for 2 months. The social world that would have received them in England, the country houses, the London dinners, the official functions, was closed. The world that received them instead was the European aristocracy's international tier, the people with large houses in multiple countries who moved through a life organized around leisure and connection, and whose willingness to host the Windsors was genuine but also, in several cases, interested. Charles Badeau was interested. He had hosted the wedding and followed it immediately with an invitation. He was organizing an industrial tour of Germany, and he thought the Duke and Duchess of Windsor might find it educational. He had connections to the German industrial establishment. He had, though this was not foregrounded in the invitation, connections considerably more direct than that. The tour was scheduled for October 1937. Wallis spent the summer months between the honeymoon and the German tour in the particular limbo that would come to define the Windsor life, moving between borrowed houses and hotel suites, present in social worlds without permanent position in any of them, receiving guests who came partly out of genuine affection and partly out of the social value of proximity to a man who had been King of England 5 months ago. She organized the households they moved through with the same attention she had brought to Bryanston Court and Fort Belvedere. She managed the staff. She planned the menus. She kept Edward's schedule. These were the skills she had, and they were genuinely useful, but they were being applied now in a context without institution, without the social architecture that gave a well-run household its meaning. The wedding had made her the Duchess of Windsor. The title was real, and the absence around it was equally real, and both of these things traveled with her through the summer of 1937 toward Germany, toward the photographs that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The tour of Germany began on October 11th, 1937, and lasted 3 weeks. Charles Badeau had organized it as an inspection of German labor and housing conditions, framed in the language of the Duke of Windsor's long-standing public interest in working-class welfare, the same interest he had expressed during his tours of depressed mining communities in Wales, the same concern for unemployment that had made him genuinely popular among working people in Britain during the early 1930s. This framing was not entirely false. Edward did have that interest, or had had it, and the tour did include visits to factories and housing projects. It also included, on October 22nd, a visit to Berchtesgaden to meet Adolf Hitler. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. Hitler received the Duke and Duchess in the Berghof, his mountain retreat above the town, with the particular theatrical courtesy he extended to foreign visitors he considered useful. An interpreter translated throughout. Edward spoke about labor conditions and housing. Hitler spoke about Anglo-German friendship and the shared interests of the two nations. Photographs were taken in which the Duke of Windsor and Adolf Hitler stand together in a room with good mountain light, both looking at the camera, Hitler's right arm extended in greeting. Wallis shook Hitler's hand. She stood in the photograph. What the visit meant at the time, and what it has meant in the decades since, are not quite the same thing, though they overlap significantly. In October 1937, Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland and absorbed Austria's political direction. But the full program of what National Socialism intended had not yet been executed in the forms that would define its historical meaning. Chamberlain's appeasement was official British government policy. Significant portions of the British aristocracy and establishment had visited Germany and expressed admiration for various aspects of its organization. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were not uniquely positioned in visiting in this specific sense. What made the Windsor visit different was not the visit itself, but the context that surrounded it. Edward was not a private citizen. He had been King of England 11 months earlier. The German propaganda ministry understood exactly what the photographs were worth and used them accordingly. The images were distributed widely. carrying the implicit suggestion that the former King of England endorsed, or at minimum did not oppose, the German government's direction. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front who organized much of the tour, said publicly that the Duke had been enthusiastic about what he had seen. The German press described the visit in terms that clearly exceeded what a private inspection of housing conditions warranted. The British government was alarmed. The Foreign Office sent communications to the British Embassy in Berlin. The embassy had already been monitoring the tour with the focused discomfort of diplomats watching a situation they cannot control. Sir Eric Phipps, the British ambassador, had advised against the visit before it happened. His advice had not been sought by the Windsors and had been communicated through channels that reached them and was disregarded. Wallis's specific role in the decision to make the tour has been debated since. The initiative had come from Bedeau, who had cultivated the Duke through the spring and summer. Edward's enthusiasm for the tour was genuine. He saw it as a form of the public usefulness he had been denied since the abdication, a way of exercising the diplomatic and representative function that had defined his adult life. Wallis had reservations, expressed in letters to friends before the trip, about Bedeau and about the optics of the German connection. These reservations did not prevent the tour from happening. This is one of the fixed points of the Windsor story that resists clean interpretation. Wallis was not politically naive. She had spent years in diplomatic social circles and understood how actions read. She raised concerns and then accompanied her husband through 3 weeks of German factories and the meeting at Berchtesgaden and the photographs with Hitler, because the alternative, refusing to accompany him or persuading him to cancel, was not available to her in any practical sense. Edward's commitment to the tour was total. He did not respond to persuasion in areas where he had already decided. She had organized him in everything else. This was the first clear instance of the limit of that organization. A second American tour had been planned for later in 1937, organized also by Bedeau, to include meetings with labor leaders and President Roosevelt. The American labor movement, having examined Bedeau's labor efficiency system, which functioned by measuring workers against an idealized performance standard and penalizing those who fell short, organized a protest campaign that made the tour untenable. Bedeau withdrew as organizer. The American tour was canceled. Roosevelt declined to receive the Windsors at the White House, a decision communicated through channels that made clear it was personal rather than scheduling. The cancellation of the American tour mattered to Wallis in ways that went beyond the immediate social embarrassment. She was American. Her connections, her social references, her understanding of herself as a person in the world were rooted in an American context. The prospect of an official American reception, Roosevelt, Washington, the recognition of a country that was hers, had been something she had looked forward to. Its cancellation on grounds connected to the German tour, to Bedeau, to decisions that had been made that summer, was a loss of a specific kind. The German photographs traveled further and lasted longer than any other images from this period of the Windsor life. They appeared in newspapers around the world at the time and reappeared consistently thereafter. During the Second World War, when the Windsors' wartime movements became a matter of active Allied concern, and after it, when the full extent of the German government's intentions in hosting the tour became clear in captured documents. In those documents, among the German Foreign Ministry files recovered after the war, there were materials suggesting that elements within the German government had considered the Duke of Windsor a potentially useful figure in a post-invasion British political landscape, someone who might be returned to a throne under German management. The documents referred to this in terms that indicated planning rather than speculation. Edward denied knowing anything about this. He may have known nothing. But the photographs existed, and the documents existed, and together they produced a version of the German tour that neither he nor Wallis ever found a satisfactory way to address. She did not speak publicly about Berchtesgaden in any substantive way for the rest of her life. In September 1939, 2 years after the German tour and 3 weeks after Britain declared war on Germany, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor crossed the Channel from France to England on a Royal Navy destroyer. It was the first time Wallis had been in England since she had left for France in November 1936. The crossing had been arranged through Walter Monckton, who was still functioning as the intermediary between Edward and the palace, and the arrangements made clear what kind of return it was. There was no official reception, No member of the royal family met them. A car from the palace collected them from the dock at Portsmouth and drove them to Admiralty House, where they stayed briefly before moving to a house in Sussex lent by friends. Edward was given a military appointment as a major general attached to the British military mission in France, a posting with the surface characteristics of active service and the actual characteristics of managed distance. He was kept away from sensitive information. He was not given command. The appointment was, in the assessment of the senior military figures who administered it, the most they could offer a former king who needed to be occupied without being empowered. Wallis was not given anything. There was no role, no organization, no function. She existed beside the appointment, in the borrowed houses and hotel suites that the early months of the war produced, managing the domestic arrangements with her usual precision in circumstances that were becoming progressively less manageable. The posting to France ended abruptly in May 1940, when the German advance made the military mission's position untenable. The Windsors left France with the Allied retreat, moving south through a collapsing situation, eventually crossing into Spain. The journey was chaotic in ways that the Windsor life rarely was. Abandoned luggage, changed routes, the particular disorder of a military collapse moving through civilian geography. They arrived in Madrid in late June, then moved to Lisbon. In Lisbon, the situation became something more complicated than exile. The German Foreign Ministry, through its ambassador in Madrid, and then through contacts in Lisbon, made approaches to the Duke of Windsor in the summer of 1940. The nature of these approaches is documented in the German files recovered after the war. The Germans were interested in keeping Edward in Europe, ideally in Spain, where he might be positioned for use in a post-invasion British political settlement. The approaches were made through intermediaries, Spanish aristocrats connected to the Franco government, a German agent named Walter Schellenberg, who was later assigned to directly manage the operation. The scheme, internally referred to as Operation Willie, involved plans to intercept the Windsors if they attempted to leave Lisbon, or to persuade them to remain voluntarily through a combination of promises and pressure. Edward did not accept the German approach. What is less clear is how he understood it at the time, what was communicated explicitly versus through implication, and whether the conversations with Spanish intermediaries that he did conduct constituted engagement of a kind that exceeded what a private citizen encountering foreign diplomatic approaches might have done. The British government in London, monitoring the situation through its own intelligence, was alarmed enough that Churchill sent direct communications to Edward, ordering him to take up his new posting, the governorship of the Bahamas, which had been arranged specifically to remove him from the European theater, without delay. Edward accepted the Bahamas appointment with the visible reluctance of a man who understood exactly what it was. He asked for adjustments to the terms. He raised the question of Wallis's title again before departing. He requested that certain members of their household staff, who had remained in France in the rush of the retreat, be retrieved before they left. These were not unreasonable concerns in isolation. Their timing, in August 1940, with the Battle of Britain underway and Churchill managing a war, produced a quality of friction that Churchill absorbed without particular warmth. The Windsors arrived in Nassau in August 1940. The Bahamas were a British crown colony with a small white administrative class and a large black Bahamian population, whose conditions of life the colonial system had maintained, with the systematic indifference of colonial systems, in forms that had not significantly changed since the island's plantation era. The governor's residence was called Government House. It was large, uncomfortable, and in need of renovation. Wallis renovated it. She approached the renovation with the full attention she had brought to every previous domestic project. The Bryanston Court flat, the Fort Belvedere weekends, the series of borrowed houses through Europe. She brought in materials, redesigned the interior, supervised the work. The renovation was reported in American magazines as a charming example of the Duchess's domestic talents. It cost $60,000 drawn from the Windsor's private funds in an era when $60,000 was not a small sum, and the Bahamas' black population was earning wages that made that figure a different kind of statement. The war that Nassau was peripheral to was nevertheless present in the colony's life. The Bahamas had been selected partly because it was isolated, and partly because its governor had limited power and limited visibility. Edward administered in the way that a colonial governor with his temperament and his situation administered. With genuine interest in some aspects of the role, and significant frustration with its constraints. Writing to Churchill and to the Colonial Office with requests and complaints that were received with the weary patience of people who had a war to run. In June 1943, a Swedish millionaire named Harry Oakes, who was the wealthiest man in the Bahamas, was found murdered in his Nassau bedroom. The murder was never solved. Edwards' handling of the investigation, which included flying in 2 detectives from the Miami police force, bypassing standard colonial procedure, and becoming involved in the case's management in ways that subsequent investigators found inexplicable, produced a scandal that attached itself to the Windsor name with the durability of the German photographs. Wallis was in the United States when the murder occurred, undergoing medical treatment. She returned to Nassau and to the investigation's aftermath and to the social world of Government House, which continued its calendar of functions regardless. The dinner parties happened. The guest lists were managed. The menus were planned. The murder remained unsolved. The war continued. The exile, which nobody called exile, extended through its 5th year in a colonial outpost at the edge of the Atlantic, while the world it was peripheral to was being remade entirely. The war ended in 1945, and the Windsors left Nassau without ceremony, as they had arrived. Edward submitted his resignation as governor in March, and it was accepted without the formal expressions of gratitude that typically accompanied the end of a colonial appointment. They moved first to the United States, staying in hotels and borrowed houses in the pattern that had become their permanent mode of inhabiting the world, and then to France, which had always suited them better than anywhere else, and which now, in the particular way of post-war Paris, was rebuilding itself in forms that included significant American money and American social energy. The question of where to live permanently was one that produced years of negotiation with the British government that went nowhere. Edward wanted a base in England, a house in the country, some form of institutional connection to the place he had governed for less than a year. The palace resisted. The government offered nothing. There was no mechanism by which the Duke and Duchess of Windsor could be absorbed back into the structure they had left, and no political will to create one. England remained what it had been since December 1936, a country they could visit but not inhabit. France offered the practical solution. In 1952, the French government made available to the Windsors, at a lease of 50 francs a year, a figure essentially symbolic, the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne, a large house on the edge of the park at the western boundary of Paris. The house was properly grand, formal reception rooms, extensive staff quarters, a garden of several acres. Wallis decorated it with the accumulated furniture and objects of 2 decades of wandering. The pieces from the Fort Belvedere years, the things acquired in Nassau and New York, and the hotel suites of the 1940s, organized now into rooms that had the quality of a life finally given a fixed address. She was 56 when they moved to the Villa Windsor. The address was good, the house was beautiful, the lease was absurd, and the life inside it was organized around a man whose health was beginning to move in directions that no amount of domestic management could correct. Edward had smoked heavily since his 20s, and by the early 1950s was experiencing the respiratory consequences. He had also developed a hernia that required surgery in 1955, and eye problems that required further procedures. He was, by the middle of the decade, making regular trips to clinics and specialists with the frequency of someone managing a body that has begun to require management. Between medical appointments and the social calendar that Wallis maintained with undiminished discipline, the dinners, the visits to friends, the seasonal movements between Paris and New York and the Cap d'Antibes, there was a quality of busyness that functioned as its own kind of avoidance. The social world they moved through in the 1950s and 1960s was real, but it had particular characteristics. It was international, wealthy, and largely without institutional affiliation. The stateless tier of people, for whom geography is organized around preference and tax efficiency, rather than belonging. In New York, they stayed at the Waldorf Astoria Towers, where they maintained a permanent suite. They attended parties given by people with large houses and significant fortunes, and gave their own, and the dinners at the Villa Windsor were considered, by the people who attended them, among the best in Paris. The food was exceptional. The flowers were exceptional. Wallace's eye for the physical details of a room had not diminished. But the guest lists had changed. The people who had surrounded them in the Fort Belvedere years, the courtiers, the senior diplomatic figures, the people adjacent to power, were largely gone, replaced by a different tier. Fashion designers, American socialites, the international wealthy, whose connection to institutional life was as attenuated as the Windsor's own. Elsa Maxwell organized parties that included them. The Duke and Duchess appeared at galas. They were photographed at restaurants. Cecil Beaton, who had photographed Wallis at intervals since the 1930s, continued to photograph her through the 1950s and recorded in his diary observations about her that moved between admiration and something colder. The beauty maintained at significant effort, the control that never quite relaxed, the quality of vigilance that had not diminished with age. In 1964, Edward was diagnosed with arteriosclerosis. In 1965, he had a detached retina operated on in Houston. In 1967, both Windsors traveled to London for the unveiling of a memorial plaque to Queen Mary, who had died in 1953 without having received Wallis or acknowledged the marriage in any form that could be called reconciliation. The visit to London was the first time the Duchess of Windsor appeared at a public royal event on British soil. Queen Elizabeth II met them briefly. Photographs show Wallis curtsying to the Queen, performing the gesture that the denial of the HRH had required of her for 30 years. In 1971, Edward was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was treated in France. The cancer was inoperable in the sense that mattered. The tumor was situated in a place that surgery could not address without consequences that his age and general condition made untenable. He underwent radiotherapy. He lost weight rapidly. His voice, which had been the instrument of the abdication speech and 1,000 tours and public addresses, became first strained and then almost inaudible. In May 1972, Queen Elizabeth visited Paris on an official state visit and called at the Villa Windsor to see the Duke. He was in bed, weakened significantly by the cancer and the treatment, connected to an intravenous drip that was moved behind furniture before the Queen entered the room. The apparatus of dying made temporarily invisible for a royal visit. He stood to receive her. The photographs from that day show him thin to the point of translucence, standing in a suit. Wallis received the Queen in the room she had decorated, offered tea, maintained the surface. She was 75 years old. She had been maintaining surfaces for 50 years. Edward died on May 28, 1972, in the early hours of the morning at the Villa Windsor. Wallis was present. He had been the fixed point of her life for 36 years. The reason for the abdication, for the exile, for the denied title, for the German photographs, for Nassau, for the Villa Windsor, and its 50-franc lease and its exceptional dinners, and its guest lists full of people with no institutional connection to anything that had mattered. She had organized everything around him. He was gone, and the organization had no object. Edward's body was flown to England on a RAF aircraft, accompanied by Wallis, who made the journey in the specific condition of a woman who had not been permitted to fully inhabit the world she was now entering as a widow. The British royal family received the coffin at Heathrow with the formal apparatus of state mourning, the guard of honor, the officials, the cars. Wallis was met by the Prince of Wales, who was 23 years old and had never spent significant time with either of the people whose story had shaped so much of the family he had been born into. She stayed at Buckingham Palace during the period before the funeral, as a guest of the Queen. This was the first time Wallis Simpson had slept inside Buckingham Palace. She was 75 years old. The rooms she was given were comfortable, and the staff were correct, and the situation had the quality of a resolution that was not quite a resolution. The palace receiving her at the moment when the reason for the conflict had ceased to be ambulatory. Edward lay in state at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and 60,000 people filed past the coffin in the days before the funeral. The crowds were larger than had been anticipated. The people who came were not, for the most part, the establishment figures whose opposition had defined the abdication crisis. They were people who remembered the tours, the handshakes, the public expressions of concern for the unemployed, the abdication speech on the radio, who had formed, at a distance, an attachment to a man who had seemed to feel something genuine about the people he was supposed to represent. Wallis stood at the funeral at Windsor with the royal family arranged around her, in the building where Edward had been invested as Prince of Wales in 1911, where his father George V lay buried, where the institution that had defined and then expelled him had its deepest physical roots. She stood correctly. She wore black. She did not weep in public. She returned to France immediately after the funeral and to the Villa Windsor, which was now hers alone. Hers in the sense that she occupied it, not in the sense that she owned it, because the lease was with the French government, and its terms beyond Edward's death were not immediately clear. The house was full of the objects of their shared life, the furniture, the photographs, the gifts from the years of movement through the world's expensive rooms, the jewels that Edward had given her across 4 decades of gift-giving that had been for him one of the primary languages of love. She was 75, alone in a house in Paris that belonged to the French government, with no children, with a body of friends that had been organized largely around the couple rather than either individual, and with a clarity about her situation that she had always possessed and that now had nothing useful to act on. The physical decline had begun before Edward died and accelerated after. She had arteriosclerosis. She had suffered a series of small strokes, the first confirmed one occurring in 1973, which affected her speech and her mobility in ways that were initially subtle and became less so. She had never been a woman who inhabited her body comfortably. The controlled thinness, the rigidity of posture, the surface management, and the body was now producing conditions that the surface could not address. Suzanne Blum entered the picture in 1973. Maitre Blum was a French lawyer of significant professional reputation, a woman in her 70s who had represented the Windsors on various French legal matters since the 1940s and who, in the period of Wallis's increasing incapacity, assumed a role that went considerably beyond legal representation. She became, in practical terms, the person who controlled access to Wallis Simpson. The mechanism by which this happened was gradual and then complete. Blum managed Wallis's medical care, her household staff, her financial affairs, and, most consequentially, her public representation. The friends who had known Wallis through the Windsor years found their visits becoming less frequent, then subject to Blum's approval, then effectively impossible. Michael Bloch, a young British lawyer who worked with Blum and who would later write about the period, described a process by which Wallis's existing social world was systematically replaced by Blum's management. Grace, Countess of Dudley, who had been one of Wallis's closest friends, tried repeatedly to visit through the mid-1970s and was consistently refused. Other long-term friends reported the same experience. Letters sent to Wallis were answered by Blum. Inquiries about her health were addressed by Blum. The person who had spent 50 years managing access to rooms and the people in them was now herself the subject of access management by someone else. Blum's motivations are not entirely transparent. She was clearly devoted to the Windsor legacy in her own terms. She pursued defamation cases against people who published material she considered injurious to the Duke's reputation, with a litigious energy that consumed significant resources. She controlled the rights to Windsor materials and managed them aggressively. Whether she genuinely believed she was acting in Wallis's interests, or whether the situation served interests of her own, the prestige of the connection, the control over significant cultural and financial assets, is a question that the people who tried to reach Wallis through the late 1970s and early 1980s answered in their own ways without access to the information that would have settled it. Wallis was in the Villa Windsor throughout this period, increasingly confined to bed, increasingly unreachable. She had dementia. The strokes had produced cognitive decline that her doctors documented, and that was visible to the few people who were occasionally permitted to see her. She was receiving medical care that kept her alive, while the life, in any meaningful sense of the word, had contracted to the dimensions of a sick room. She did not give interviews, she did not see journalists, she did not see most of her friends. She did not, as far as can be determined from accounts of the period, communicate with any member of the British royal family who did not visit. Outside the Villa Windsor, in the streets of the Bois de Boulogne, Paris proceeded with its ordinary life. Inside, in rooms that Wallis had arranged with exceptional care, the woman who had been the reason for a constitutional crisis was living in conditions of near total isolation, managed by a lawyer who controlled the terms of her existence with the thoroughness that Wallis herself had once brought to a dinner party. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, at the Villa Windsor. She was 89 years old and had been, in any functional sense, absent from the world for nearly a decade. The death was announced by Maitre Bloom, who had outlived the client she managed and would live for another 8 years. The announcement was brief and correct, and produced in the international press a wave of obituaries that had been prepared and revised across the previous decade, as her condition made the event appear imminent, and then receded, and then appeared imminent again. She was buried at Frogmore in the private royal burial ground within the home park at Windsor Castle, beside Edward. This had been arranged. The plot was there, the ground was consecrated, and the institution that had spent 50 years finding mechanisms to exclude her from its formal life received her into its earth without complication. The funeral was small and private, attended by members of the royal family. The Queen was present. The Prince of Wales was present. The burial was conducted with the correct forms. The obituaries were extensive and largely unkind, or kind in the particular way that manages to convey unkindness through the organization of facts. The German photographs were reproduced. The abdication was described in terms that consistently placed agency with Wallis rather than Edward, a framing that the historical record complicates but that the obituary form, with its requirement for narrative simplicity, tended to enforce. She was described as ambitious, cold, calculating, the words that had followed her since 1936, and that functioned, by 1986, as a settled interpretation, requiring no further examination. What happened to the things she left behind is a story with its own clarity. The contents of the Villa Windsor, the furniture, the silver, the paintings, the decorative objects accumulated across 5 decades of life in the world's expensive rooms, were auctioned by Sotheby's in Geneva in April 1997. The sale was organized by Mohammed Al-Fayed, the Egyptian businessman who had purchased the lease on the Villa Windsor from the French government, and who had an interest in the Windsor story that went beyond the commercial. Al-Fayed had positioned himself as a custodian of the Windsor legacy and organized the sale with the promotional infrastructure of someone who understood that the object's value was inseparable from the story they had inhabited. The auction produced extraordinary results, objects whose intrinsic value was modest, a small enamel box, a set of monogrammed linen, items that would have sold for small sums without their provenance, reached prices that reflected the purchase not of the objects themselves, but of their adjacency to the story. A gold cigarette case sold for multiples of its estimate. Table decorations from the Fort Belvedere years, the same rooms where courtiers had watched Wallis manage the king's household, were bid on by collectors from across the world. The jewels were sold separately, also at Sotheby's, also in 1987. The Windsor Jewel Collection was one of the most significant assembled in the 20th century. Edward had given Wallis extraordinary pieces across 4 decades, many of them commissioned specifically for her, several of them incorporating stones from pieces belonging to the royal collection that had been given to Edward as personal gifts during his years as Prince of Wales and King. The collection included work by Cartier, Van Cleef, and Arpels, and other significant houses, in designs that reflected Wallis's specific and demanding aesthetic preferences. The pieces were not merely expensive. They were considered by the people in a position to assess them genuinely important examples of 20th century jewelry design. They sold for a total of $50 million. The proceeds went to the Institut Pasteur in Paris, which had been designated as the beneficiary under the terms of the Windsor estate. The Institut Pasteur is a medical research institution of significant international standing, and the bequest was legitimate and substantial. It funded research. It was used for the purpose for which it was designated. It was also a destination that had nothing to do with the life the jewels had inhabited. The pieces that Edward had commissioned for Wallis, the Cartier flamingo brooch, the Van Cleef pieces, the jewels that appeared in the Cecil Beaton photographs, and in the images from Fort Belvedere and the Bahamas and the Villa Windsor, passed from Sotheby's auction rooms to private collectors and institutions with the efficiency of objects whose human context has expired. The British royal family had expressed through various channels in the years before Wallis's death interest in recovering pieces from the collection that had originated in royal gifts to Edward. These approaches had been managed by Bloom with the same litigious caution she brought to everything involving the Windsor estate. What the family did not recover before the auction, it could bid on. Some pieces were acquired privately in advance of the public sale. The complete record of those acquisitions is not public. The Villa Windsor itself remained in Al-Fayed's possession after the 1997 auction. He had plans for it: a museum, a restoration, a permanent installation of the Windsor story as he understood and promoted it. These plans did not materialize in the form he intended. The house sat, through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, in a condition of maintained stasis, the rooms emptied of their contents, the garden continuing its slow work of growing, the address in the Bois de Boulogne still legible on maps of the 16th arrondissement. Al-Fayed's son Dodi died in Paris in August 1997, in the same summer as the Sotheby's auction, in the car accident that also killed Diana, Princess of Wales. The Villa Windsor receded from Al-Fayed's active attention after that. The plans diminished. The house remained. In 2013, the French government, the institution that had provided the 50-franc annual lease that made the Windsor life in Paris possible, resumed control of the property. It was subsequently sold and eventually renovated as a private residence. The rooms that Wallis had decorated with the accumulated eye of 50 years of practice were redone. The garden was replanted. The address remained the same. The story it had housed was gone, replaced by whatever the new owners brought to it, which was their own and had nothing to do with abdications or denied titles or 3-week German tours or the particular quality of a dinner party managed by a woman who had been practicing the art of the room since she was old enough to understand what a subsidized tuition meant. The letters patent denying Wallis the style of Her Royal Highness were issued on June 27, 1937, 24 days after the wedding at the Château de Condé. They were drafted by the Home Office, reviewed by the royal solicitors, and signed by George VI with the advice of his government. The legal mechanism employed was a clause in Edward's instrument of abdication that had been interpreted selectively, as constitutional lawyers would subsequently argue, to mean that his renunciation of royal rights and privileges extended to any rights that might otherwise have passed to his wife through marriage. The interpretation was disputed from the moment it was issued. Edward's own legal advisors produced opinions suggesting that denial had no firm constitutional basis. Several independent constitutional lawyers reached similar conclusions across the following decades. The matter was never brought to a formal legal determination because there was no mechanism by which the Duke of Windsor could compel the Crown to review a decision made by letters patent, and because the political will to review it did not exist in any government that held office between 1937 and Wallis's death in 1986. What the denial produced practically was a requirement that applied every time Wallis Simpson was in a room with members of the British royal family. She curtsied. They did not curtsy to her. This had been the rule since 1937, and it was enforced consistently, including at the 1967 London visit for the Queen Mary plaque unveiling, including at Windsor during the days surrounding Edward's funeral in 1972, including at whatever brief encounters occurred in the years between. The gesture, the lowering of the body, the formal acknowledgement of superior rank, was performed by a woman in her 70s, then her late 70s, each time the situation required it. Edward's campaign to reverse the denial was conducted across 3 decades through every channel available to him. He raised it with George VI directly on multiple occasions. He raised it with the private secretary's office. He raised it with successive prime ministers, Attlee, Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, each of whom received the representations with diplomatic care and did nothing. He commissioned legal opinions. He corresponded with constitutional experts. He wrote memoranda that went into files, that went into archives that have since been partially released, documenting the campaign in the obsessive detail of a man who could not accept that a decision had been made against him without remedy. The campaign failed completely and consistently. The family's position never shifted. The official explanation would that the denial rested on legal grounds, coexisted with the private understanding, visible in the correspondence of senior courtiers from the period, that the denial was substantially personal. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who had been Queen Elizabeth during the abdication crisis and who had formed her view of Wallis Simpson in 1936, maintained that view without revision until her death in 2002. Her influence on the question, through her relationship with George VI and subsequently with her daughter Elizabeth II, was not the only factor, but it was a consistent one. The specific content of her view of Wallis Simpson is documented in the letters she wrote to friends during and after the abdication crisis, several of which have been published. She blamed Wallis for the abdication in terms that were unambiguous and that did not moderate over the following decades. She referred to Wallis in private correspondence using language that reflected the absoluteness of the judgment. This was not the view of a woman who was prepared to reconsider. Wallis understood, with the clarity she had always brought to reading rooms, that the denial was permanent. She continued to raise it with Edward because he needed to raise it, and she managed his needs, but she did not expect resolution. The evidence for this is indirect but consistent. The absence in her own correspondence, and in the accounts of people close to her, of genuine surprise at each successive failure. She had been trained by experience to understand which doors were closed from the inside and which ones would not open, regardless of who knocked. What is harder to determine is what the title meant to her beyond its practical ceremonial function. Edward's investment in it was transparent. It was the last significant thing he could do for her, the reparation he owed for what the abdication had cost, and his failure to secure it was experienced as a personal failing he could not resolve. His letters about the HRH question have the quality of someone who cannot put down a weight, because putting it down would require acknowledging that it cannot be moved. Wallis's investment is less legible. She had spent her life working toward the rooms that the HRH would have placed her inside automatically. The denied title was the formal expression of what she had always understood about her position, perpetually adjacent, never quite absorbed, invited into the structure without being granted membership. In this sense, the denial did not change her situation. It codified it. The irony that organized itself around the title across the decades is that the institution which denied it was the same institution that had shaped everything she became. The Baltimore girl who understood that her name was right, but her money was wrong, who had learned to read rooms and manage powerful men and organize households into something that looked like belonging. She had been trained by her desire to enter an institution whose fundamental mechanism was exclusion. She had entered it further than almost any outsider in its history, and the institution had found, in the end, the specific instrument. 4 letters, 1 decision, letters patent dated June 1937, to mark the distance it had maintained throughout. After Edward died in 1972, the HRH question became moot in the sense that there was nobody left to raise it. Blum showed no interest in pursuing it. The royal family showed no interest in revisiting it. The matter settled into the historical record alongside the abdication and the German photographs and the Nassau murder and the Villa Windsor and the $50 million jewel auction. Queen Elizabeth II granted the style of Her Royal Highness to Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, upon her marriage to Charles in 2005. The decision was made by the sovereign and announced without significant legal complication. The mechanism that had been described as insurmountable in 1937 was, when the sovereign wished it, entirely surmountable. This fact entered the historical literature without producing any official comment from the institution involved. Wallis Simpson died in a house that wasn't hers, in a city that wasn't her country, managed by a woman who wasn't her friend, survived by an institution that had spent 50 years finding ways to mark her as outside it. She was buried beside the man who had given up a throne for her in ground that belonged to the family that had never accepted her, with the correct forms observed by people whose mothers and grandmothers had considered her the source of a wound that hadn't fully healed. The historical record she left behind is unusually dense and unusually incomplete simultaneously. There are the government files, the MI5 reports, the Foreign Office cables, the German documents, the courtiers' diaries, the letters that were sealed, and the letters that were published, and the letters that Blum litigated to suppress. There are the Cecil Beaton photographs, the Sotheby's auction catalog, the 50-franc lease, the letters patent. There is the abdication speech, which Edward wrote with Churchill's help, in which Wallis is described but not named. What is not in the record is Wallis herself speaking directly about any of it. The memoir she published in 1956 moves around the significant events of her life with the care of someone who has decided, permanently, that the things that matter most will not be given to the public record. China is sightseeing. The abdication is grief. The denied title is a wrong without elaboration. Whether she made Edward happy is a question that produces different answers, depending on whose account of their life together you accept. Whether she was happy is a question that the record does not answer at all, and that she appears to have considered nobody's business. She had spent 60 years managing what rooms could see of her. The management did not stop when the rooms emptied out. What remains is the outline of a life shaped almost entirely by exclusion. First, the exclusion she was born into, then the exclusions she spent decades navigating, then the final and formal exclusion, 4 letters withheld, that the institution placed on her like a door it had decided, from the beginning, to keep closed. Whether she ever stopped wanting it open is something nobody asked her, and she never said.